This evening is not traditionally a time of big welcomes, big greetings. It's a time where we are somewhat mourning, national mourning, but it is a pleasure to see each one of you here tonight, and I'd like to invite you to come on a quick journey. We're not going to get stuck in any era of history, but a quick journey through 3 examples of national conflict, civil war, and then hopefully come to some positive message of conciliation and peace and even love. Now, for those who haven't met me, my name is Dovid Shmerling. I've recently joined the Spiritgrow family, and I work primarily in it's called community engagement and education. I arrange programs and try to connect to people here, and so far everyone who I've met has really been a pleasure, lovely, and I look forward to meeting the rest of you. We're going to have 3 parts in the history tonight. The first part will be about the civil war in the times of the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes in biblical times, where the kingdom of Israel split. And then we'll move on to my wife, Nechama, for part 2, the end of the Second Temple period. And then back to me for part 3, which is the Haganah Irgun conflict, both working towards basically the same goal, but still having different means and different opinions on how to get there, as well as other Jewish groups who all had different opinions, and this is in the early 1900s, especially the 30s and 40s, outside of the Nazi tragedy that was happening in much of Europe and other parts of the world. Now, anyone know what this is? Okay, we'll have to call on Beryl. It's right in the front. It's Israel, yes. And it's divided up into tribes. This is, there's many scholars who have different opinions exactly how the tribes should be divided. This is how one scholar divided it. This is my wife's, the way she divided it. But we're going to look at the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes and what became the divided states of Israel. Okay, just to begin, I like to look at the Torah, the Bible, often as 2 steps. Step number 1 is family building, and step number 2, nation building. So we start off and we're trying to get a family right. Now the families, the brothers, it was maybe if there would be more sisters it would have worked better, but it was mostly brothers, and they didn't get on too well. So here we have Cain and Abel, Cain and Hevel. This is 2 of the sons of Noah, where after the flood, the third one had uncovered him, abused him in some way, and then 2 of the other sons covered him, treated him with respect. And this continued through history. Ishmael and Isaac also had very different paths. There's midrash that talks about them as even adversaries, to the degree that Ishmael wanted to kill him by mistake. And that continued through the generations with Jacob and Esau, Yaakov and Esau. They also didn't get along. They fought over the birthright. This is all stories of family. Finally, even within the Jewish people, Joseph and his brothers couldn't get along. So what do we have? Generation after generation after generation of family strife. And once we get through that, we finally get to 2 brothers that finally got along, Manasseh and Ephraim. And that's when, once we've got the family right, we can move on to national building. So we start off, and really we try out different models. We start off with a strong leader, an inspirational leader, Moses, and the people have, in order to have a nation, you have to have a shared history and a shared goal. The shared history was their slavery in Egypt, among other things. The shared goal was commitment to the Torah. And now they have two strong bonds. Now we've got to start trying out different types of governance. So we try out first a real libertarian system. The tribes were, the judges, the period of the judges was pretty much free. You only have a leader when you need one. You go to a leader for advice, go to a leader if there's a war. But basically everyone lives themselves, really low taxes. And that was the first model. The problem was everyone does what they want, right? No strong governance. Everyone does what they want. Then we move on to a second model, which is kings. Now, we all want to go back to our period of kings, the greatness, the majesty of King David, King Solomon. How long did that last? How long did we really have a king over Israel? How many years? 400-ish? Well, sort of, but really a lot less. Depends what you mean by that. How long did was this period that we're all looking back towards? 80 years or even less. King David originally was only the king over his tribe. It took 7-8 years till he consolidated control over the whole nation. And then we've got about 72, 73 years when we have the rest of King David's reign, King Solomon's reign, and that was it. So in our Jewish history, we have, of our 3,000 plus years, we have about 73 years where we had this big, strong kingdom, not under any threat, well, especially with Solomon, not under threat, and they could work on building a nation together. Now, the kingdom didn't last as a unified kingdom for long. Okay. So, one of the big issues was, and this has stayed an issue with leaders until today, is are they using their power as a leader of the people to improve their personal business and their personal life? Right? Does it sound familiar in any way? There was no one, what I can tell you is no one borrowed government planes for private business in this story. There was no international, there was no ties involving America or Russia. But what there was, in a smaller way, here we have the temple built by Solomon, and then right next to the temple, there had been this area which King David had set aside so that it should be easy to get into Jerusalem. Thousands of people would come to visit Jerusalem on the holidays. So King David set aside this area right next to where the temple would be. It would be easy to access. Some people could even plant their tents there. They can sleep there while in Jerusalem. Now, Solomon had a lot of servants. And not just he had his whole staff and his wife, the daughter of Pharaoh, and he had this marriage. It was partially a political marriage, but his wife had a huge staff, a lot of servants as well, and she needed space for them. So there's this big open space, high real estate, the middle of town. I'll take it. And he does. He makes it a Solomon Tower. And he makes it actually for his wife, daughter of Pharaoh, for her people, and it would be her palace. And that enraged some people, especially since they wanted this ability to get to Jerusalem. There was a fellow called Jeroboam, and he complained. He said, no, this is not allowed. You are disturbing the people, blocking the people from coming to Jerusalem. Now, this actually was the beginning of the split because he had to run away. In those days, if you speak up against the king, you wouldn't have a long lifetime. So he leaves and goes off to Egypt where he would be protected. Now, this ended up with a split within our house. Once Solomon dies, he feels free, he comes back. The people are thinking about whether to accept Solomon's son as king. His name was Rehoboam. And Jeroboam comes back and says, what's going on here? Solomon had high taxes. We're not going to allow this to go on anymore. Of course, Solomon had a lot of national projects. This is still a question till today. Do we have a lot of national infrastructure with higher taxes or lower infrastructure with lower taxes? Solomon was into higher taxes relatively and better infrastructure. The people were well off. It was a time of plenty, so it worked. Now, the people said, that's it. The taxes are too high. They complain, and Rechavam says, sorry, fellas, whatever the tax was under my father, it's going to be even worse. However strict my father was, you are going to experience even worse. He whipped you with regular whips. I'm going to whip you with scorpion whips. And this is how he alienated the people right at the beginning. There was another issue, which was that the other tribes felt that the family are getting all the positions. The family are getting most of the benefits over the rest of the people. David was from the tribe of Judah, Yehudah, and people felt that all the power, the wealth, it's all going to Judah. We've got nothing to do with it. So, Jeroboam now provides an alternative. He's going to become a new leader. Now, what he does is, and this is fascinating, because what was his first sort of shot at leadership was to be the one to complain about giving the people space, right? Giving the people space for what purpose? What do they need space for? Access to Jerusalem, to the temple. And now, as soon as he becomes king, what does he do? He blocks access to the temple. Now that will tell you something about when you hear a politician fighting for the people, fighting for honesty, and then once he gets in, he immediately works to dismantle what he was officially fighting for. The reason he did that was because Jerusalem represented King David. In the temple, the only king who got respected was the king in the Davidic line. He didn't want people seeing him going to the temple and being the second best, so he immediately blocks the roads to Jerusalem. He also offers an alternative. You don't need the temple. You don't need the Jewish temple. I'll make 2 new temples in the north of Israel and in the south of his area, and that way you'll be able to have a full religious life without heading to Jerusalem. Okay. So, after only about 73 years now, we have the divided states of Israel. Now, okay. Now, what happens is the people at different times have, and we'll talk about this, they have their times of peace where they can work together and times of war. What happens straight away when Jeroboam declares independence is war. Rechavam is ready, he's got his army, he's ready to attack. A prophet comes and says, stop, this is from God. But battles, skirmishes continue. This continued for 2 generations. Ongoing skirmishes, nothing too devastating, but ongoing skirmishes. The first almost tragedy was when now we've got the grandson of Rechavam as king, Asa, and he notices that they're starting to build right on his border. They're building a fortress on his border called Ramoth, and they're ready to attack. What the smaller kingdom, the Davidic kingdom, which was the smaller kingdom under King Asa, has to do is call in Syria to help. They call in Aram, Syria to help, and And basically what happens is Syria attacks Israel from the north. Israel can no longer fight with Judah, with the smaller kingdom, and they have to stop building the city, and that is the end of that. There were continued times of war throughout, and actually the ending of Israel happens through another one of these cases. The northern kingdom of Israel attacks Judah. Judah calls in this time Assyria, and then Assyria ends up exiling the tribes. So basically, what happens is that because Judah is under attack from the north, they call in an enemy of all the Jews, Assyria. The first time they called in Syria, which are two different kingdoms, Syria and Assyria. They call in Assyria the second time. Assyria ends up in stages, but attacking and exiling the tribes. Okay. Let's move on to types of leadership. First, just one point before about peace. They did work together at other times. There were times where they both helped each other against a common enemy. Sometimes they were constantly changing alliances. So there were times where they marched together. There was even a time where they got killed together. There was a fellow called Yehu, a general, and he assassinated the king of both the north and the south in one day and became the king of the north himself. Right? So they were together, the north and south, and they were assassinated together, leading to two new kings on both sides. Okay. We have limited time, so we'll just talk just briefly, types of leadership. Number one, that with Israel and the northern kingdom, it was about the fist. You got the power if you had the power. Whereas in the south, there was this sense more that they wanted the kings to be true to David, humble, genuine, and also someone who came from the Davidic line. So there was a different style, more gentle style of leadership. And that also caused the second difference. While in the north there were frequent rebellions, I wouldn't give life insurance to a king in the northern kingdom because they were killed on average, about 25 years. They were assassinated. But in the south, it continued with one family the whole 450 years. And actually, even when there was assassinations of kings in the south, which did happen, not many times, but it happened a couple times, the next king would always be the son of the previous king, even if the previous king was killed for being highly unpopular. So they would not let it leave the family. Okay. Take-home lessons from part one. We described two kingdoms, north and south. What Kabbalistically was the difference between them? In Kabbalah, it describes them as one being the ideas, the talented, the thinker. And actually, I wrote about this in my piece this week. If whoever read David Southwick MP, we were doing offices around Spiritgrow. We happened to be up to David Southwick last week. So the Northern Kingdom was all about ideas and talent. And therefore, whoever's the most talented got in. When someone wasn't so the right man, he was knocked off straight away. Whereas in the South, there was this feeling of, I might not be the greatest, I'm not perfect, but I'm doing my best, I'm trying to make a positive impact. So the lesson for us in terms of the enduring kingdom, the Davidic line, is that we want a kingdom over the people, but also personally within our own hearts, one which will be action-oriented, which will think, what is the practical result? Does this bring to better lives rather than platitudes and staying in the theory? Okay. And here we have our two models again for the North versus the South. One of them being more aristocratic, the other being more humble. We are not going to be apart forever. Very soon we're going to have the reunion of both the Davidic line and the northern kingdom with Mashiach. Okay.
Can I have the clicker? Thank you. Tonight is Tisha B'Av. There's the Beis HaMikdash. We're going to focus now on the time period of the second Beis HaMikdash. This is a course I normally cover over 2 months, and I'm going to condense it down into 15 minutes, so it's going to be good. There's the Beis HaMikdash. It was standing for 400 years, the first Beis HaMikdash, 10, thank you, and 420 years, the second Beis HaMikdash. It was destroyed by the Romans. But how did the Romans get into the picture? What were they doing there? How did they come? So in order to answer that question, we really need to take it back to the story of Hanukkah. In the time of the story of Hanukkah, the Macedonian Empire was in charge of Israel. There's Israel right up there. And the Macedonian Empire spread way across it, and the Greeks are running the show. The Jews don't like it too much. The Greeks make a lot of rules against them. So there's a particular family who stands up against them. In particular, Matisyahu and his 5 sons, the first 2 rows up there. So Matisyahu Mattathias says, we're going against these people. The Greeks are not doing well for us. And his 5 sons continue in that fight. What I want to focus on, though, is after the 5 sons' success and the story of Hanukkah, Shimon, the guy listed in the middle, is the last remaining of the brothers. And his son, John Hyrcanus, becomes the next king, Yochanan Hyrcanus. And he is the first to call himself a king, even though he is of the line of Yehuda. And he's from Levi because he's a Kayan, and he's supposed to be calling himself a Kayan, and instead he calls himself a king. His sons, Alexander, Aristobulus, and Antigonus, have these huge amounts of fights. They end up killing each other, and it ends up, the last one up is Alexander, who passes, and they pass on the brotherly conflict. So I'm going to zero in with a little more detail on the brotherly conflict between Aristobulus and Hyrcanus. That's when Yonasan had Yerushalayim, had Eretz Yisrael, that's Shimon expanded it further. And then under the time period of Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, they had a really fair stretch. That green stretch is under the jurisdiction of Israel. It's a fairly big piece of land. They should have been comfortable to be able to run it together. The problem was that when their father died, that wasn't the problem yet, because their mother was a fantastic ruler. After she died, Hyrcanus was the older son, and she says, Hyrcanus, you're going to be the king. And Hyrcanus was actually a little bit of a weaker character, but his mother said that he was the king, so he was the king. He runs the show for a while until his brother Aristobulus starts to attack him. And there starts to be a lot of tension between these 2 brothers. You've got Aristobulus and Hyrcanus fighting over the crown. The grandchildren of the Maccabees, and yet they're destroying what the Maccabees started. It gets to the point that they need someone else from outside to arbitrate between them. So in comes Rome. There's 2 brothers fighting over the crowns, and here comes Rome. Roman Empire is slowly creeping their way across, and now with the invitation of these 2 brothers fighting, they make their way into Jerusalem, into the whole land of Israel. At first, they rule by long distance. And one of their procurators, one of the last procurators, this is a depiction of Florus. It's a screenshot from a BBC documentary that goes through the story of the Chorban. So that's the picture that I've got from there of Florus. Florus is a procurator of the Jews. He's the one collecting the taxes. He's the one managing the local affairs. And he's supposed to be the one keeping the peace. However, Florus was out there for his own good instead of out there for the peace. And when local citizens sacrificed a bird in front of a local shul there, Florus should have been the one bringing peace and finding a way to manage that conflict. And instead, he allows the battle to escalate. In fact, he allows it to escalate to the point of sending his soldiers into the Beis HaMikdash to take out 17 talents of gold and silver from the sacred treasure. With that money that they removed, He gets the Jews very angry at him, and they end up fighting. But this is where we start to approach the real thrust of my talk tonight, with the three groups of Jews who are interfighting with each other. You've got external pressures because there's Romans on the outside, and the Romans came in to start because of two brothers who weren't getting along. And now you've got three groups who are at odds with each other. There's the Sadducees. The Sadducees believed in peace at all costs. They were the aristocrats. They were very comfortable living under Rome. They pretty much enjoyed having their pleasurable society. And they weren't too fussed whether they were keeping the Beis HaMikdash, whether they were not going to keep the Beis HaMikdash, if the temple was going to go, if it wasn't going to go. As long as they could have a good, comfortable life, they would have preferred to be Roman citizens. That would have been their dream come true. Religiously, there's a lot of tension because the Sadducees are the group of people who follow only the literal Torah. So there's a lot of tension between them and the other groups. The Zealots, by direct contrast, had completely opposite views to the Sadducees. The Zealots were zealous. They were passionate, and fiery, and angry. They did not like the Romans being in charge. And the Zealots decided that they preferred liberty or death. Those were their two choices. They didn't see any middle ground. It was either we get the Romans out of the country, or we have no reason to exist if we don't have our own individual entity. And this was a huge point of tension. You can imagine groups of people who are trying to have peace at all costs and groups of people who are saying peace is the last thing we want these Romans out of here. As far as the Zealots were concerned, they remembered the story of Hanukkah. That was 165 BCE. This is 60 CE. It's merely 200 years. They said, we can have another victory, just like Hanukkah. It's only been 200 years. We can gather up our forces. We just, all we need is a bit of strength, a couple of miracles here or there. We'll be able to do it, no problem. They tried. They stocked up weapons. They tried convincing everyone, but they didn't manage to get, they had a following, and this was a huge tension. There was a third group, though. The third group are the Pharisees. The Pharisees, also known as the Perushim, were mostly the Jewish leaders, and the rabbis were mostly the Pharisee group, where they said, we want to negotiate for a plan of Jewish continuity. It's okay if Rome is in charge, as long as we can live. If we can be alive, then we're good. If we can follow the Torah, and they're not going to make all the rules like the Greeks did, then that's fine. We're okay with that, as long as we can find some sort of middle ground. And the Pharisees were hunting for that middle ground. Sadducees say peace at all costs. We're happy to live in Roman society. Zealots say, no way, it's liberty or death. And Pharisees are like, come on, come to bargain, come to peace in between. Unfortunately, this erupted into a full-scale war. You've got, just by way of visualization, you've got the Beis HaMikdash up in the center, in the upper city, and there are three walls surrounding Yerushalayim. So that's why I've got three circles there. The Zealots are guarding the gates. They're trying to make sure that no one goes in and out. There's another wall up here, and the Sadducees are in control in the upper city towards the Temple Mount. They still allowed for people to bring karbanos. They allowed them to bring sacrifices up to the temple. That was fine. And at one point, the Zealots even managed to worm their way in by coming disguised as if they were bringing regular karbanot, regular sacrifices. And inside their coverings of what they're going to bring were all their weapons, and they start a conflict where they manage to fight with the Sadducees and take over control of the Temple Mount. So there's just a huge amount of fighting going on in the inside of this whole entire picture. We've got a Beis HaMikdash we're trying to protect, and they're trying to protect it by fighting with each other. Three groups in huge conflict and tension. Vespasian, again, that's the picture of the guy from the documentary, so it is what it is. That's Vespasian outside trying to capture Jerusalem, and he's just biding his time. He's just sitting there with all his soldiers. He has no need to launch an actual offensive because the Jews inside are busy doing all the hard work for him. Unfortunately, we were bringing about our own destruction. After a time, Vespasian starts to starts to launch an all-out offense, but we'll get there when we get there. In the meantime, we've got a city destroying itself with Jews fighting each other on the inside. Not a pretty picture at all. One beautiful story brought in the Talmud of an act of cooperation between two sides is the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a Pharisee. He actually went on to hold the position of Nasi, leading the Jewish nation for a period of time directly following the Churban, the destruction. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai turned to his nephew. His nephew was Abba Sikra, a zealot. He turns to his nephew and he says, devise a plan for me. Help me make a plan so that we can save a little something. That save a little something is a classic Jewish expression. We're just going to try to make a little save. We'll try to save a little something. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, together with his nephew, come up with a plan. Even though one is a zealot and one is a Pharisee, they managed to find a way to work together. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai fakes his own death, manages to leave the city. So if you've got this over here, he's coming out of the city, and he has a chat with Vespasian over here. When he chats with Vespasian, the Roman general, he arrives at Vespasian's tent and says, greetings, emperor. Vespasian says, treason. What are you calling me the emperor? The emperor's off in Rome. I'm a general here. That's treason. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, no. I know Jerusalem is only going to fall to an emperor. So obviously, you are an emperor if you are having this amount of control over Jerusalem. And Vespasian's like him and hawing. In the meantime, in the middle of the conversation, an envoy comes from Rome, announces that yes, indeed, the Vespasian has just been appointed emperor off in Rome. He's very impressed, to the point that he grants Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai 3 wishes. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai chooses amongst his wishes, he chooses a small townlet off in the coastal side, a small town called Yavne, which is going to be a place of haven for some of the scholars, some of the Pharisees to be able to gather and lick their wounds after the battle and establish a plan for Jewish continuity. So even though you've got huge tensions going on there is some little act of collaboration that ends up being a window towards our future. Do you know why Vespasian was sitting out there for so long? Vespasian's sitting out there, and he's stuck. He doesn't even bother launching an offensive because he knows that inside there are 3 storage houses full of wood, flour, barley. It was all stocked up. The Jews had enough supplies to last 21 years. The Romans had to bring all the supplies up. They could have outlasted no problem. 21 years worth of supplies prepared for them inside the city. No one was rushing to fight, except for the zealots. The zealots wanted to fight so badly that late one night, they set fire to the storage houses, bringing true famine onto the city. And now, all the people in the city are slowly wasting away with hunger. The Jews who used to be able to stand at the gate and guard the gate don't have the same amount of energy. The people who are fighting with each other, they're no longer fighting with each other actively because they're just out of energy. They just can't fight anymore. They can't fight inside, they can't fight outside, they're kind of just waiting for the day of doom. Finally, the Romans pull out their heavy artillery. Battering rams, catapults, siege towers, 15 days, and they knock down that first wall. 8 days, they knock down the second wall. And they go at the third wall, and they go at the third wall, and they go at the third wall, and they can't make it through. While they can't make it through, they build another siege tower so that they have the advantage of height and start fighting down towards the Jews in the center. And while they're fighting down towards the Jews in the center, there are some clever zealots who build a tunnel underneath, climb out, set fire to the siege towers underneath. That worked to a point, but unfortunately, on the day Hashem decides that the Beis Hamikdash is going to go, it's going to go, regardless of all the ingenuity. So after one morning, the Romans wake up and basically find a crack in the hull of that third wall because the wall sank into the tunnel that the Jews had built earlier when trying to attack the siege towers. Make sense? So the Romans are in 3 weeks of hand-to-hand fighting on the inside, And then on the 9th of Av, the Beis HaMikdash burns down. I always think about how these three groups could really, it's just such a shame. They had such talent amongst them. You had Sadducees who knew how to get along with other people. They knew how to become chummy with Rome, to be able to work well with them. And if those Sadducees would have used their talents to be able to be a team and work together, if they would have used their talents to be the diplomats of the society, to be the ones to speak to the Romans, they had the talent, they had the aristocracy, they could have done it. They could have pulled together. They could have all worked together. Think about the Zealots. The Zealots were passionate and fiery. They wanted to fight. They could have backed up those diplomats. Look, we got a war happening. They could have backed them up. They could have worked together. They could have done it. You got the Pharisees giving them purpose and mission, being able to find a bridge between them, help them work together. They could have done it. These three groups working together could have solved the whole problem. Instead of having Jew against Jew, brother against brother, we can have one Jew with another working together and bringing us to the ultimate time where we're all able to work together as one. Before I hand back to David, I want to bless all of us that we're able to find within us the ability to be able to work with all the people around us, no matter what kind of challenges or difficulties that may arise in our interpersonal relationships, but that we're able to find the ways and the talents within every single member of the team in order to find that little piece that can make us work together as one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nechama. That was lovely. Okay, the stormy pre-1948 days, Haganah, Irgun, and non-Zionists. Now, imagine you were there, living 100 years ago, let's say. Do you think that the Zionists were a majority of the Jews? Definitely no. Assimilationists were quite a big percentage of Jews who thought it's not good to be Jewish, let's just assimilate. That's our best solution. And there were many, especially in countries like Germany, Austria, France, even some parts of Hungary, that was their belief. Bundes, who wanted to become socialists, joined Russia, and they didn't believe in any homelands. They were into Jewish culture, but not a homeland. We'll stay within Russia. The Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox, also were against it. They said Judaism is about religion, not nationality. So this is not a good idea. Reform were against it. They said we're not a nation. We're Germans of Hebraic origin. And they said our temple is not in Jerusalem, our temple is in Berlin, our temple is in Philadelphia. And modern Orthodoxy as a whole, separated from religious Zionism, was also generally against it because they wanted to keep the main Orthodox traditions without it stopping them being a proper citizen of their country. There was, within Zionists, if we divide into three main groups of the mainstream revisionists and religious, and this really came to the fore, especially in the last 20 years before 1948, especially with the mainstream versus revisionists. Okay, what I'm going to look at specifically is the three main fighting groups, and they were the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi. Haganah was the main fighting group. They represented the leaders of, so to speak, mainstream Zionism. Irgun represented revisionist Zionism, and Lehi represented a ultranationalist, or what they would probably prefer to call themselves, anti-colonialist. They were England was an imperial power who had colonies all over the world, and they were giving freedom to the people. That's what Lehi was all about. By the way, they weren't against the term. They weren't against being called terrorists. They said, well, if if that's what it takes, it's sometimes legitimate. Okay. So here we have some of the main ideas that divide them. The Haganah was left-wing, into workers' rights, into unions, similar to how we saw in Russia and America at the same time that the leaders of unions, socialism, were very often Jews. They were secular, they were strongly secular, and they wanted to have good relations with England. Some of them prided themselves on their English citizenship. Chaim Weizmann, who became the first president of Israel, had a hard time. He had to give up his English citizenship in order to become president. That's something that some Australian politicians forgot about. But he had a hard time with that. Then we have the Irgun. The Irgun was right-wing. The leader was, the central leader was Jabotinsky, Vladimir Jabotinsky. His Hebrew name was Zev Jabotinsky. And he was into capitalism, rights of the individual. And that was one of their values. As you see also that often came with a strong military, that we're going to redeem this land by force, unless we get it by will. If they want to give it to us by will, they're welcome to. Otherwise, we will redeem it by force. And they were also more sympathetic to tradition, although they weren't religious, but they were sympathetic to it. There was many years later, Menachem Begin, when he was prime minister, he once arrived in South Africa right before Shabbos, and he didn't take he didn't allow for himself to be driven to where he needed to go. He walked for a couple hours. Because he represents the Jewish people, he has to be respectful of tradition. Actually, although they would attack British soldiers, they would have attacks running 6 days a week. They wouldn't make their attacks on Shabbos. Respectful of tradition, except for one big one. England were not expecting an attack on Shabbos, and one of their major attacks, the King David Hotel, which was a place where a lot of the English government and soldiers had their base, that was on Shabbos. But they were generally more sympathetic to tradition. Lehi are a bit hard to place in terms of the right to left, because on one hand they were ultra-nationalists, which puts them where? On the right. On the other hand, they were very into social benefits, that in our future state everyone will be taken care of. They also, in many cases, it's not that they had a problem with the Arabs. They had a problem with the imperial power England. And actually that's why once the state was established, they divided up. They became the ultra-left and the ultra-right in politics. So that was their war. They also were very weighted towards the state over individual. And we have their emblem in the top corner. Now, some of the actions taken. So, with Haganah, what were their primary missions? Well, for one, Israel was a wasteland. The Haganah, the Jewish Agency, the Histadrut, which were all related, they all represented part of government. And what they needed to do is make sure that everyone has, together with England, make sure everyone has electricity, make sure everyone has water, make sure that there's basic services. There should be proper postage. They were diplomats, as you see there, Ababan over there, who represented Israel, explained, it wasn't yet Israel, but explained the position of the Jewish people in wanting this area. They were much better at fundraising. With one of the most famous charities associated, which is JNF, in Hebrew, kakal, which Karen Kayemet L'Israel, which ensured that there would be lands that could be used for farming and agriculture. And they also had a defense force which was called Haganah. But this defense force was very careful. They were about defense, not about attack. And it took a long time for them to sort of work out, because how are we going to defend every single Jew in Israel? But that was what they tried to do, to not go on the offensive, just keep us safe. Okay. Irgun's main actions. Well, it was about lowering the British flag. That's what their goal was. What they did was either illegal immigration until the last few years before the state. From 44, 45 till 48, Haganah joined the bandwagon, and they had a much bigger organization. They took care of most illegal immigration. But Irgun were the main ones at it. Now, when I say illegal immigration, just imagine the situation. We have Jews waiting to be killed in Europe. We have survivors, later on we have survivors from the Holocaust in Europe. And England set a very strict policy of how many Jews would be able to come in. And the point was, effectively, to make sure that the Arabs remain a strong majority, and that when England leaves, it will be given to the majority people, which were the Arabs. The Irgun and really all Jewish groups countered that with saying, this is not a homeland to the ones who are already here. This is a homeland for the whole Jewish people. And therefore, in that way, we are the majority here. There was never a sovereign Arab nation in this area, and therefore there's some people here. Most of them actually came to work on Jewish farms, Jewish industry, and therefore they have a lesser claim, although they are numerically more than us. So there we have the ship with the immigration. They also fought against targets who were considered enemy to them, whether they be English soldiers or Arabs. Now, the particular picture I've got here is from a policy they had when England. Yes, sorry.
Were you able to ask questions? Only after.
When England would frequently hang members of Irgun for the various attacks that they did, and then they had this counter policy that if England hangs 2 of their men, they're going to hang 2 British soldiers, which caused a real uproar around the world, and things like this sort of made England start thinking maybe this is not a good idea. It also caused a lot of inter-Jewish tension, because many Jews are traditionally, if anything, tilted towards being somewhat, they want to pacify. They don't want to. They're not warrior-like. They hadn't been warrior-like for 2,000 years. And these types of scenes were not popular in some Jewish circles. Okay, Lehi was the smallest of the 3 groups. Their main action, again, they hated England. They were not big enough to launch large-scale attacks, but what they would do mostly is targeted assassinations. Now, probably the most controversial idea of Lehi, even more than all their assassinations and everything else, was what do we do during the Second World War? Do we continue our fight with England because they're blocking us from entering the land, they're blocking us from achieving sovereignty in our traditional lands, they've got anti-Jewish policies, or do we help them because they're fighting Germany? The Arabs told England that you do one thing for the Jews, we're going straight over to Germany. And in fact, many of the leading Arabs in Israel did help Germany, most famously Husseini. But the Jews normally didn't have that option. So Haganah, Irgun all said, we're fully with England. We'll be soldiers in the British Army. We'll fight for the Allies, and we've called a ceasefire. Lehi, at least until 1941, until what was called the final solution, God forbid was announced, they considered England as bad, if not worse, than Germany. And they said that they thought that they could make a deal with Germany, that they'll make a deal, they'll bring all the Jews from Europe to Israel, and that way Germany will have no problem. They don't want Jews in their country, but if we get them out, get them to Israel, we'll be able to make some deal and we'll support them. Whereas England wants to control the whole world. England are the imperialists, and therefore they are the bigger enemy. Now, this was very unpopular in the Jewish community, and that type of idea of making pacts with whoever will help our cause was very unpopular, but that was their view, at least in 1939, 1940. Okay, so here we have just a bit of a summary. We've got Haganah, services, diplomacy, together with also defense. We've got Irgun, which were immigration and fighting back, and Lehi, which was primarily assassinations. Okay, just a few of the famous incidents. One, the Acre prison breakout. Now, this was a really strongly defended building. It was considered impregnable and impossible to attack. And this was one of Irgun's greatest achievements. They had many of their soldiers who were imprisoned there, some waiting to be hanged. And they worked out a way where they would be. There was a bathhouse right next to it, and they worked out a way. They're going to bring in disguised bombs. They've got some from the outside, some from the inside. They're going to blow it up. Their soldiers were already ready. They knew it was happening, ready on the inside to blow up a few doors and get out. It was an amazing operation because this was right where it was a center. There was many British soldiers all around. It was a really daring operation. They did it. Many got killed during the operation, but they did manage to free some of their prisoners, some of their friends from Irgun who were imprisoned there. Okay, a few of the contentious episodes. I'm not going to be able to discuss all of the ones here, but most, as much as we can. Havlaga is restraint, strategic patience. And what it meant was that although England is disturbing, is blocking us from bringing more Jews here, they're letting the Arabs have arms, they're not letting the Jews have arms. There's a lot of policies that are really causing problems, but we're going to have restraint. That was the official government, Jewish government and Haganah policy generally, in order to have good relations with England. And there you see, instead of going on the offensive, this was a bus. This was how a regular bus looked then. And you see that it's got all this fortification just to go to work or go to school. The Irgun, of course, really disliked this policy. Now, next, about passively fighting the British. Until we came to 44, 45, generally the official Jewish leadership believed to avoid it. If we start bringing in thousands of Jews to Israel, they might just cancel the whole thing and say no more Jews allowed. Whereas that was what the official leadership said. The Irgun said, no, we've got to bring in as many as we can. We've got to fight them in a determined way. And this was the white paper, England's policy, which limited the amount of Jews who could come in. Okay, then we get even further, not just passive resistance, but active resistance, active war. And we had cases of hangings, using like bomb explosions and other ways of attacking in hit and run, and do your attack, run away. Of course, what would the organized Jewish leadership say? These are terrorists. We've got to stop this. Okay. There was the highest ranking British leader in the Middle East in 44, I think, was Lord Moyne. He was assassinated in Egypt by two Irgun soldiers, and that started the hunting season. I just put a sticker on here from more modern times, but the idea was, the hunting season meant that the official Jewish leadership will help England catch the Irgun members and dismantle the organization. This sticker says that a Jew doesn't expel another Jew, but in that case the sticker would have been a Jew doesn't arrest or kill another Jew, and that was also a very contentious policy. How could you be helping England arrest us and then hang us? You know that's going to happen, and the other side is saying, well, you're endangering the whole country. This is another contentious issue. Stavsky affair was also major at the time. It was a leading member of the mainstream Zionist Chaim Arlasrov got shot and killed while walking on the beach in Tel Aviv. And this fellow Stavsky was suspected of the murder. Someone had seen someone who looked like his face fit the description that Mrs. Al-Asraf gave. And basically, he was arrested. First, he was found guilty. Then in the appeal, he was found not guilty. But it was a whole thing and a whole contentious issue. And part of it was that he was a member of the revisionist Zionists. He was a sympathizer of the Irgun. And this became a whole question. Are the Irgun inciting murder of opposing parties? And on the other side, the Irgun saying this is just a community lynching, that they're lynching our community, that they're blaming us, and this is all not true. He didn't do it, and you're blaming us all for nothing. Okay. Altalena. Now, the name came from the leader of the revisionists, Jabotinsky, whose pen name when he was a journalist was Altalena. And this was a big ship full of weapons that could have really helped in the independence war. This is 1948. They need all the weapons they can get. The Irgun brings this ship full of weapons, and they've got an agreement that 80% will go to the Haganah, the main army, the main now organ of the state. 20% will go to Irgun, who was still active in Jerusalem. And that was agreed upon. The problem was does this 80% go to the army to do what they want, or does it go to Irgun fighters within the army? Now, perhaps the Irgun felt that their fighters were getting discriminated against, or whatever it was, but they had a special love towards them, affection towards them, but they said, we want a lot of this 80% to go to our fighters within who had joined the regular army. This became a big contentious issue, and at the end, Ben Gurion gave the order to Rabin and Alon, two young generals, that they've got to, if the ship doesn't agree to give over their ammunition, everything on the ship, to the army to do what they want with their own discretion, then we're going to blow up the ship. So the ship is already, a lot of it had been unloaded, but it still had a lot of weapons on it. They move to Tel Aviv beach in front of everyone. They think they're going to be safe. They have hundreds of supporters there on the beach, and they weren't safe. And as their supporters, some of them are swimming towards the ship. They're starting to take out some more of the weapons. The new Israeli army shoots at them, and according to the captain there, it was a mistake, or either it was a mistake, it wasn't a mistake, but the weapons, the ammunition in the bottom of the ship takes on fire. Begin, who later became the Prime Minister of Israel, was on that ship helping to take out weapons, and he jumps out into the water. There continues being shooting both ways in the water, and 16 of the Irgun members are killed. 3 of the Haganah of the Israeli army were killed in this battle. And Menachem Begin says, he gives the order to stop firing, wave the white flag, and no fighting against brothers. Lo tiyeh milchemet achim. There will not be a war of brothers. And that stopped the incident from really getting worse. After that, the Irgun was amalgamated into the Israeli army and ceased being a separate group. Okay, just to end with something a little more positive, reapproachment. One is that Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion had a few positive meetings, and they worked out a system of collaboration, and it could have been better. It could have been better. As Nechama said earlier, we've got some people who are better at diplomacy, some people are better at fundraising, others are going to supply the selfless fighters and daring fighters, and it could have been better. They were actually they did make 3 agreements. They were on the verge of a lasting agreement. Unfortunately, people on others back home didn't accept the agreements, and it fell through. This was in the one in the 30s. Actually, it's interesting also that with Begin and Ben-Gurion, later on, Begin went to visit Ben-Gurion in 1967, right before the Six-Day War, and Ben-Gurion said, if I would have known you like I know you now, history could have been different. Right? So there was a really low level of trust between the two. And it's really amazing that Rabin, who had been a captain there when they had shot people in Altalena in that boat, and in the water there at the beach, that whole battle, later on was in politics together with Begin. And now they had meetings in offices and they discussed policy, yes, from different parties, but still they had to a degree, work together despite their more stormy past. Okay, I guess the lesson, and we're going to also Eichan questions, but we've got to think about ways to recognize differences and come together for the common good.